Hi, I'm Mary Kopczynski, the CEO of RegAlytics, here in full gala attire, minus the pretty shoes. I really wish the weather had cooperated because this hair is not going to last. I'm annoyed because it didn't rain all day, but it's supposed to rain at the exact time I'm walking to the ferry, which is not ideal. This week, there were 32,060 alerts, 784 past bills at the state level in the United States. Maryland in the lead with 193 past bills. Quite a few interesting ones, which of course I don't have time to get into because of what I'm going to talk about today. So I will just launch into it. The regulators of the week are the Bretton Woods institutions. And for the record, once again, these institutions, which are the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and in some circles, the World Trade Organization, are what my entire dissertation was on. I did focus exclusively on the WTO, but you just cannot get a PhD in world trade and global affairs without learning a lot about the other two. In fact, last August, my husband, Kid, and I were on one of our classic RV trips to New Hampshire, and we were driving up this mountain pass, and we got to the top, and there was this clearing with a bit of a higher hill in the distance with a massive, and I mean massive and beautiful hotel. And I immediately pulled out my phone because I recognized the building and I didn't know why. But then I immediately started suspecting and confirmed my suspicions that I was in fact looking at the Omni Mount Washington Resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, which was the famous location in 1944, which for the record was in the middle of World War II, where 44 nations established the IMF and the IBRD, which later became the World Bank. And while the WTO wasn't yet established, the concept was born generally about cooperating in relation to international trade. So it was pretty cool to see. And I could really understand, especially where we are today with Ukraine, Gaza, and now India and Pakistan getting into skirmishes, how the area is really peaceful and beautiful and remote. And it seems like an amazing place to sort of reset and rethink about what the ideal future for the world could and should be. And it was at that conference that pretty much drove the last 75 years of peace and security. And now with all these tariff wars and actual wars, it feels like we're swinging the pendulum back in time where we're questioning and tearing down what the original purposes of these institutions are. So pardon me for a little bit of schooling, but starting with the World Bank, the original purpose was specifically to help European countries rebuild after World War II. And now, today, the mission of the World Bank is to fight poverty and promote sustainable economic growth for developing countries. The IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, was supposed to stabilize the currency exchange rates and expand international liquidity. And today, the IMF has 191 member countries that pay dues. And the idea is that this international agency will be a place where economies can be measured using the same methodologies. And if you're a member, you can go there for advice on some of your policies relative to other countries, but also you can get financial assistance in times of crisis. So the idea back then really was to promote emerging economies so that they could essentially take care of themselves and prevent war in the future. Over time, both agencies were called into question because they had loaned money to certain nations in Africa who were advised to open up their economy to outsiders, which means remove their tariffs. And a number of economists at the time thought this would help developing economies. But later, it's been largely accepted that these policies ultimately got many of these African nations up to their neck in debt that they could barely service. And these strict open policy requirements basically allowed foreigners to come into the area and profit as opposed to the local African nations. I mean, think about it, right? If McDonald's is on every corner in, Kampala, what does that do to the local burger shop, right? And finally, there's the WTO, and I'm not going to get into it because you can go ahead and watch my video from a few weeks ago where I give you the background on that particular organization. But anyway, there was this surge around the 90s of what we call the financial tigers, right? Which are Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. And they did not follow the IMF World Bank plans, but they grew anyway. So lately, some of the Asian countries, especially China, are showing up as an alternative creditor for some of these emerging economies, so they don't have to take the money and the obligations of the IMF World Bank plans. They can take the money instead from some of these Asian nations and even with the competition get better terms. Anyway, fast forward today, these institutions, IMF, World Bank, still exist, and they are there for emergencies and development. But with all this focus on America first and tariffs and the end of USAID as we know it, the world is looking at these institutions with a sharper lens, a bit of skepticism, and really a new, fresh set of eyes. There were 66 alerts about and from these organizations this week alone, which is fairly normal, but please understand, even Janet Yellen under the previous administration was calling for a need for these organizations to evolve with the changing times, catch up on tech, for example, and also become more accountable for their own actions. So what does the current administration think about these agencies? Well, we have a peek, because during a House Financial Services Committee hearing this week, the new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, talked about the IMF and World Bank, and he's after them for things you'd expect, like their recent scope, what he calls mission creep into climate and social initiatives. But keep in mind, and he didn't say this, but the U.S. pays the most dues to both the IMF and World Bank compared to all the other members. So you can anticipate this administration is going to push for deals. Bessent said that it wants them to go back to the original plan of promoting fiscal discipline, anti-corruption, which is roughly the same, and private sector growth to ensure a sustainable global economy. The hearing also included discussion on China's growing influence as the world's largest creditor, with concerns that China's pretty opaque about its practices and the shift of these developing countries moving towards Chinese financing over this US-backed financing. I really wish I had more time to go over some of the alerts here, but I got to get to this gala. So that's it this week for RegAlytics. We have the global supply chain of the world's regulatory alerts in one very easy to use place. And if you need a solution for anything related to regulation, give us a call.